The wind was a living thing. It had no body, but it had a voice, a low, mournful moan that scraped along the eaves of the small cabin and clawed at the wooden shingles of the roof. It spoke of a cold that went deeper than skin and muscle, a cold that settled in the bones and stayed there, a constant, unwelcome guest. Outside, the world had vanished, swallowed by a swirling vortex of white. The Wyoming frontier in the heart of a blizzard was not a landscape. It was an erasure. The snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid, driving sheet, burying fences, smothering trails, and piling itself into impassable drifts against the north-facing wall of Sarah Duval's home. Inside, the only light came from the hesitant flicker of a single tallow lamp on the small, hand-hewn table, and the more robust, hungry glow of the fire in the stone hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows that made the one-room cabin seem both smaller and larger at once, a pocket of warmth and life, holding its own against an indifferent eternity of cold. Every so often, a gust of wind would find a chink in the daubing between the logs and send a puff of ash billowing from the fireplace, a gray ghost that dissipated into the air. Sarah had grown accustomed to the sound. She had grown accustomed to the solitude, to the immense, pressing silence that followed the wind's howl. 4 years she had been a widow. 4 years since the mine collapse had taken Thomas and left her with nothing but this cabin, a small plot of stubborn land, and a son whose eyes were the same shade of clear blue as his father's. Her own eyes, a softer gray like a cloudy sky, were fixed on the small cot in the corner. Eli, all of 7 years old, was lost in the troubled sleep of fever. His small chest rose and fell with a shallow, rattling breath that seemed to catch in his throat. His cheeks were flushed with an unnatural heat, and a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the chill that permeated the room. For a week, the fever had held him in its grip, waxing and waning like a cruel tide. She had done everything she knew to do. She had brewed willow bark tea until her fingers were stained, forced cool cloths upon his brow, and whispered prayers into the smoky air until her throat was raw, but the fever clung to him, stubborn as a winter frost. Sarah rose from her rocking chair, the worn wood groaning in protest. The floorboards, smoothed by years of use, were cold beneath her stockinged feet. She moved to the cot and gently laid the back of her hand against Eli's cheek. He was burning. A small, worried sound escaped her lips. The cough had started yesterday, a dry, barking thing that shook his small frame and left him breathless and afraid. She looked towards the small cupboard where her meager medical supplies were kept, a half-empty bottle of laudanum for pain, some dried herbs, and bandages. Nothing for a fever this deep. Nothing for a cough that sounded like tearing cloth. The nearest doctor was in Cheyenne, a 2-day ride in good weather. In this storm, it might as well have been on the moon. A fresh wave of wind slammed against the cabin, and the wooden shutter over the single window rattled violently in its frame. It was a sound that usually meant nothing, just the storm's endless tantrum. But this time, something else carried beneath it, faint, muffled by the thick blanket of snow, yet unmistakable. Hoofbeats! Sarah froze, every muscle in her body tensing. Her hand, still resting on Eli's forehead, drew back as if burned. Hoofbeats in a storm like this. No one traveled in a whiteout unless they were desperate, or foolish, or dangerous. Her mind, conditioned by years of frontier living, immediately leaped to the worst possibilities. Raiders, perhaps, driven from their usual paths by the weather, or a lone drifter, mean with cold and hunger, who saw her lamplight as a beacon of opportunity. Thomas had always warned her. A light in the window is a welcome to a friend, he'd say, cleaning his rifle by the fire, but it's an invitation to a wolf. The sound grew closer, a heavy, plodding rhythm. A single horse, struggling through the deep snow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady roar of the wind. She moved swiftly, silently, across the room, Her hand reached for the rifle resting on the pegs above the door. A long-barreled Winchester. Thomas's pride. Its weight was familiar in her hands, the steel cold and solid and real. It was her only true protection, the final arbiter in any argument she could not win with words. She checked the load with an practiced flick of her thumb, the brass casing of the cartridge glinting in the firelight. The hoofbeats stopped directly outside. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the storm and the ragged sound of her own breathing. Then came a new noise, a weary, exhausted groaning of leather, followed by a heavy, sodden thud. It was the sound of a great weight falling into the snow. Sarah crept to the window, her rifle held low, its muzzle pointed at the floor. The glass was thick with a delicate, feathered layer of frost. Using the edge of her fingernail, she scraped a small peephole, her breath misting the space as she pressed her eye close. The world outside was a churning gray canvas, but she could make out a shape. A horse, head hanging low, its coat matted with snow and steam rising from its heaving flanks. And beside it, a dark mound in the snow. As she watched, the mound stirred. It pushed itself up, slowly, painfully. It resolved itself into the shape of a man. He was tall, far taller than Thomas had been, and broad-shouldered, even beneath a heavy, snow-covered greatcoat. He swayed on his feet, one hand braced against the horse's flank for support. He took a staggering step towards her porch, then another. He looked less like a man walking and more like a building about to collapse. He was hurt. She could see it even from this distance, through the swirling snow. He moved with a stiff, unnatural gait, and when he turned slightly, she saw a dark patch spreading across the side of his coat, a stain the color of wet earth against the dark wool, a color that the falling snow could not quite conceal. He reached the edge of her small covered porch, his boots sinking deep with every agonizing step. He stumbled up the single wooden step and leaned heavily against one of the support posts. His head bowed. For a long moment, he just stood there, a great, dark statue of exhaustion, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Sarah watched, her knuckles white where she gripped the rifle. Every instinct screamed at her. A lone woman, a sick child, an unknown injured man at her door in the middle of the worst storm of the year. It was a recipe for a story that ended in tragedy, a tale told in hushed tones by neighbors at a lonely gravesite in the spring. She had heard the stories. She had seen the hardness in the eyes of men who passed through this territory, men whose pasts were etched in the lines on their faces and the way their hands never strayed too far from the pistols on their hips. A woman alone was a temptation, a home, a fire. Food, these were treasures out here, and men had done terrible things for far less. The man pushed himself away from the post. He took one last, lurching step and raised a hand, dark with a leather glove, towards her door. He was going to knock. He was going to ask for entry, for sanctuary. He was going to bring his violence, his pain, his unknown troubles across her threshold and into the small, fragile world she had fought so hard to protect. Eli coughed again from the cot, a weak, wet sound that tore at her heart. The sound seemed to break the spell of her fear, replacing it with a fierce, cold resolve. This cabin was not just her home. It was her son's fortress. It was the only defense he had, and she was its only guard. Her finger tightened on the trigger of the Winchester, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of her hand. She stared at the rough-hewn planks of her front door, imagining the man on the other side, his presence a palpable weight against the wood. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and duty, of the memory of her husband's warmth and the chilling reality of her isolation. She didn't make a sound. She didn't move towards the door to bar it. She simply stood in the shadows, a sentinel in her own home, the firelight catching the determined set of her jaw. As his shadow fell across the frosted glass of the window, she drew in a steadying breath, the air tasting of wood smoke and sickness. A whisper, so quiet it was barely more than a thought. formed on her lips. A prayer sent not to God, but to the stranger on the other side of the door. "Please don't come inside." The knock, when it came, was not the sharp rap of a confident visitor. It was a heavy, dull thud, the sound of a fist meeting the solid oak of the door with the last of its strength. It was followed by a second, weaker one, and then the scraping noise of a body slumping against the wood. Sarah flinched, the rifle coming up instinctively to nestle against her shoulder. It stuck cool and hard against her cheek, her eye aligned with the sights, aimed squarely at the center of the door, at the heart of the man she could not see. The wind howled a counterpoint to the frantic pounding in her ears. A voice seeped through the wood, raspy and broken, shredded by the cold and exhaustion. "Please," the word was barely a breath, almost stolen by the wind. "Ma'am, please, just shelter, till the storm breaks." The voice was not angry or demanding. It was a raw plea, stripped of all pride. It was the sound of a man at his absolute end, a part of Sarah, the part that remembered church sermons on charity and the innate human duty to a fellow soul in peril, felt a sharp pang of pity. To leave a dog out in this weather was a cruelty, to leave a man. But fear was a more powerful preacher than any parson. Fear spoke of survival. It reminded her of the two prospectors who had passed by last summer, their eyes lingering too long on her, their questions about her husband pointed and greedy. Thomas had been alive then. He had stood on the porch, his hand resting casually on the Colt at his hip, his presence a silent, unbreachable wall. They had moved on, but now the wall was gone, and she was alone. "There's nothing for you here," she called out, her voice tight and stronger than she felt. "Keep moving. There's a trading post 2 days north." It was a lie. The closest post was a week's ride, and in this storm, 2 days north was a death sentence. But it was a lie meant to save her, and to save her son. A ragged cough answered her from the other side of the door, a deep, wet sound of pain. "Ma'am, I can't. I'm hurt. My horse is spent." The voice was fading, each word an effort. "I won't cause no trouble. You can keep the gun on me. I'll sleep by the hearth. Please." The image his words conjured was terrifyingly intimate. A stranger in her home, sleeping by her fire, his unknown dangers breathing the same air as her child. She thought of Eli, so small and vulnerable in his sickbed. Her resolve hardened into a cold, sharp shard of ice in her chest. "I said no," she shouted, the words tearing from her throat. "You bring your trouble here. You'll meet more of it. I'm armed, and I won't hesitate. Now go." She pressed her ear to the door, listening. For a long time, there was nothing but the shriek of the wind. No reply, no further pleading, no sound of movement. He had heard her. He understood. He was leaving. A wave of something that felt like relief washed over her, so potent it left her knees weak. She lowered the rifle, her arms aching from the tension. She had done it. She had protected her home. She had made the hard choice, the only choice. But the relief was tainted with a bitter aftertaste. She saw him in her mind's eye, a tall shadow staggering back into the white fury of the storm, the dark stain on his coat spreading, his life seeping away into the snow. She squeezed her eyes shut, pushing the image away. It was his misfortune, not her doing. He was a stranger. Eli was her son. The choice had been clear. She turned from the door, her fortress once again secure, and her gaze fell upon the cot. In the moments of the confrontation, the sound of Eli's breathing had been a steady, albeit troubled, backdrop. But now, the sound had changed. A new noise had joined the rasping inhale and the sighing exhale. It was a faint, high-pitched whistle, a wheeze. It began at the end of his breath, a thin thread of sound that spoke of passages tightening, of air struggling to find its way. Sarah's blood ran cold. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees on the rough floorboards. She placed a hand on his back, His small body was rigid with the effort of each breath, and she could feel a terrifying vibration rumbling through his chest. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. They were wide with a fear he was too young to understand, the primal terror of not being able to draw a proper breath. "Mama," he whispered, his voice a tiny, frayed thing. "It hurts." The wheezing grew louder, more pronounced with every breath. It was the sound of a failing machine, the sound of the life inside her little boy being slowly, inexorably squeezed out. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Sarah by the throat, choking her far more effectively than any intruder's hands ever could. The man outside was a potential danger, a phantom of what might be. This was a real danger. This was death, circling her son's cot, its shadow falling over his small, fevered face. All the herbs and prayers in the world were useless against this. She needed a doctor. She needed medicine. She needed a miracle, and all she had was a useless rifle and a cabin full of fear. A sob caught in her throat, a sound of utter helplessness. It was then that the voice came again from beyond the door, so faint she almost thought she had imagined it. A ghost on the wind. "Ma'am." She froze, her hand still on Eli's back. He hadn't gone. He was still out there. The voice was a thready whisper now, clinging to the edge of consciousness. "The boy, that cough, is it his lungs?" How could he have heard the wheezing was faint, barely audible over the storm, even inside the cabin? He must have had his ear pressed to the wood, listening, waiting. Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was locked tight with despair. The voice persisted, a little stronger now, as if fueled by a final, desperate thought. "Ma'am, listen to me. I was fetching supplies in my saddlebag. There's medicine." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide, staring at the door. "From the apothecary," the voice rasped, the words tumbling out in a hurry. "In Cheyenne, there's a tincture for lung fever. It's what I was carrying for a fever, a cough like that." The words hung in the air, seeming to push back the sound of the wind. Cheyenne. The name of the town was a shock of reality, a tether to the civilized world she had thought lost to her. An apothecary. Not some home-brewed remedy, but real medicine. It was impossible. A trick. It had to be a trick. A desperate man's lie to gain entry. But then Eli gasped, a sharp, strangled sound, and his body arched in a silent struggle for air. The wheezing was a sharp, cutting knife of sound. The stranger's words were a seed of impossible hope planted in the barren soil of her despair. A lie. Perhaps. But what if it wasn't? What if salvation was slumped against her door? Bleeding into the snow, the risk of letting him in was immense. He could be a liar, a thief, a killer. He could bring ruin upon her and her son. But the certainty of doing nothing was Eli's shallow, wheezing breaths growing shallower still, until they stopped altogether. The rifle lay on the floor where she had dropped it. It seemed a foolish, useless thing now. It could stop a man, but it could not stop a fever. It could defend a life, but it could not save one. She looked from her son's agonized face to the unyielding wood of the door. The man on the other side was no longer just a threat. He was a choice, a terrible, terrifying choice. The man groaned, a low, final sound of surrendering strength. "Please," he breathed, the word dissolving into silence. Sarah stared at the iron latch on the door. It was cold and dark and absolute. To lift it would be to invite the storm into her home, to welcome the unknown and all its potential for violence. But to leave it shut might be to condemn her own child to a slow, silent death in the heart of that very same storm. The world shrank to that single point her hand, trembling in the firelight, and the cold iron that separated a dying stranger's promise from her dying son. Time stretched and became a thick, suffocating thing. Each second was measured by the thin, sharp blade of sound from the cot as Eli struggled for breath, and the profound, heavy silence from beyond the door. It was the silence that was perhaps more terrifying. Had the stranger collapsed? Had he finally succumbed to the cold in his wound, his life ending just feet from her warmth? The thought sent a fresh spike of a different kind of fear, a colder, more insidious dread. Through her, the fear of being a bystander to death. Her mind presented her with two ghosts. The first was the ghost of the man outside, frozen in the snow, his unheard story ending at her doorstep. His blood would be a stain she'd have to see every day until the spring thaw washed it away. The second, more terrible ghost was that of her own son, his small chest finally still, his blue eyes clouded and unseeing, all because his mother had been too afraid to open a door. It was a devil's bargain, laid before her by a cruel and indifferent fate. One life weighed against another, the life of a stranger, a possible threat, against the life that was the very center of her world. There was no choice. Not really. A mother's heart does not calculate odds. It answers a single, primal call. To protect, to save. And right now, the only path to saving her son led through the very danger she had sworn to keep out. Her movements were stiff, robotic, as if her body were being controlled by a will that was not entirely her own. She retrieved the Winchester from the floor. Its weight was no longer reassuring. It was the cold, heavy burden of her choice. She did not raise it to her shoulder this time. She held it in one hand, its muzzle pointing downwards, a grim scepter of the authority she was about to both exercise and surrender. She walked to the door. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden planks. The fire crackled in the hearth, oblivious. The wind screamed its fury, a constant, raging chorus. She reached for the iron latch, her fingers trembling. The metal was colder than ice, and the touch of it seemed to draw the last of the warmth from her body. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Every instinct, every lesson of survival Thomas had ever taught her, screamed a silent, frantic warning. Don't do it! A lock is easier to keep than to reset. A danger kept out is a battle you don't have to fight. But then a small, choked gasp came from the cot. Sarah lifted the latch. The door groaned open on its leather hinges, and the storm lunged inside. A furious blast of wind and snow exploded into the cabin, sending ashes scattering from the hearth and making the single lamp flame gutter wildly, threatening to plunge the room into darkness. The cold was a physical blow, shocking the air from her lungs. He fell in with it, a heap of snow-caked wool and failing limbs. He didn't step across the threshold so much as collapse over it, landing in a heap on the floor just inside the door, bringing the storm in with him. The door swung shut behind him with a deafening slam. Pushed by a gust of wind, the cabin was plunged back into a dim, flickering twilight. For a moment, all Sarah could do was stare down at the man on her floor. He was a mountain of a man, even in his collapsed state. His greatcoat was frozen stiff, and melting snow was already beginning to pool around him on the floorboards. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his movements slow and agonizing. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound. And when he lifted his head, Sarah got her first proper look at him. His face was not the face of a simple ruffian. It was a map of hard miles and harder decisions. A thick, dark beard, dusted with ice, covered his jaw, but it could not hide the lean, gaunt lines of his cheeks. A scar, a thin white line, cut through his left eyebrow. But it was his eyes that held her. They were deep-set, the color of a stormy sky, and they were filled with a weariness that went bone-deep. They were not the wild, greedy eyes of the prospectors she'd met. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and was tired of looking. He blinked slowly, trying to focus on her. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Sarah didn't answer. She took a step back, the rifle still held tight in her hand. "The medicine," she said, her voice flat and hard. "Where is it?" "Saddlebag," he breathed, his gaze flicking towards the door. Left side. He tried to push himself up further and failed, falling back with a sharp intake of breath. His hand went to his side, and Sarah saw that his glove was dark and stiff with frozen blood. The dark patch on his coat was larger than she had realized. She knew she couldn't leave him there, bleeding on her floor, a barrier between her and her son. The cold air he had brought in with him was already filling the small room. "Get up," she ordered, gesturing with the rifle barrel towards the rocking chair by the fire. Slowly. He nodded, his jaw tight with pain. Using the door frame for leverage, he began the Herculean task of getting to his feet. Every movement was a study in agony. He swayed, and for a moment, Sarah thought he would fall again, acting on an instinct she didn't know she possessed. She darted forward, grabbing his arm. The sheer size and solid weight of him was startling. He was all hard muscle and bone beneath the thick, wet coat. He leaned on her heavily, his breathing a ragged, hitching sound in her ear. She could smell the cold on him, the scent of wet wool, horse, and the faint, coppery tang of blood. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she held firm, her fear warring with the immediate, practical need to get him settled. Together, they shuffled the few feet across the room. He collapsed into the rocking chair, his head falling back against the wood, his eyes closing. He seemed to shrink, all the fight going out of him, leaving only a large, wounded man bleeding by her fire. She backed away, the rifle once more a barrier between them. She watched him for a long moment, his chest rising and falling in shallow pants. He made no move. He seemed barely conscious. The medicine. She turned, unbarred the door, and braced herself. She pulled it open just enough to slip through and was immediately assaulted by the blizzard. The wind tore at her, trying to rip the door from her hand. She fought it, pulling it shut behind her, and was left in the roaring, blinding white of the storm on her own porch. The horse was a statue of misery, its head low, shivering violently. It didn't even stir as she approached. The saddlebags were stiff with ice, the leather frozen solid. Her fingers, already numb with cold, fumbled with the frozen buckles. They wouldn't give. Panic flared. She ran back inside, grabbed a skinning knife from the wall, and returned to the horse. She sawed at the thick leather straps, her breath coming in ragged plumes. Finally, a strap gave way and the bag sagged open. She plunged her hand inside. Her fingers met a canvas-wrapped bedroll, a blocky shape that was probably hardtack, and a spare wool shirt. No medicine. Despair began to creep in. Had he lied? Was this all for nothing? She ripped open the other side, her movements frantic now. Her hand closed around a small, canvas-wrapped parcel tied with twine. It felt solid, rectangular. She didn't wait to inspect it. She clutched it to her chest, slammed the cabin door shut, and threw the heavy bar back into place. The world was once again reduced to the small, fire-lit room. The stranger hadn't moved. His breathing was shallow, but steady. She stumbled to the table, her hands shaking so badly she could barely untie the frozen knots of the twine. The knife. She used the tip of the blade to slice it open. Inside the canvas was a smaller package wrapped in oilcloth. She unfolded it carefully. Lying on the oilcloth were 3 items. The first was a small, cork-stoppered glass bottle filled with a dark, thick syrup. A paper label, written in the neat, precise hand of an apothecary, read pine balsam compound for coughs and congestion of the lungs. Her breath caught in her throat. It was real. The second item was a small tin box. Inside was a white powder. The label on the tin read, fever powders. 1 dose mixed with water every 4 hours. It was quinine, most likely. The very thing the doctor in Cheyenne had given Thomas for a fever he'd caught 2 years ago. The last item made her pause. It was a small, dark blue vial, no bigger than her thumb, with a tight-fitting glass stopper. The label on this one was starker, the letters printed in bold, black ink. It contained only one word: morphine. Sarah stared at the vial. Morphine. She knew what it was. A powerful painkiller, used by doctors for the worst kinds of injuries. It was also a substance whispered about, a dangerous temptation that could steal a man's soul. Its presence was both terrifying and profoundly reassuring. No common drifter carried a doctor's kit like this. This was not the random collection of a charlatan. These were specific, potent medicines, professionally prepared. The morphine was for his wound. She realized. The pain must be immense for him to carry something so powerful. He hadn't lied. The knowledge settled over her, not with a sense of relief, but with a heavy, complicated weight. The man in her chair was not just a random threat. He was a man on a mission, a man carrying life-saving medicine. His story, whatever it was far more complex than she had imagined. He had been telling the truth. She looked from the medicines on her table to the man slumped in her chair, and then to her son, whose wheezing breaths seemed, for the first time, not like a death sentence, but like a problem that might have a solution. She had let a wolf into her home, a great, wounded predator, but it seemed he had brought with him the only cure for the sickness that was already inside. A flicker of something fragile and unfamiliar sparked within her chest. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of a belief that she had not just opened her door to a man, but perhaps to a chance. With the precious medicines laid out on the table, a fragile truce settled over the cabin. The stranger, the immediate threat, was now also the source of a desperate hope. And this paradox held Sarah in a state of suspended action. But the rasping sound from the cot was a constant, urgent reminder of her purpose. She moved with the deliberate focus of a field medic, her fear packed away behind a wall of grim necessity. First, the fever powders. She measured a dose from the tin into a cup, her hand surprisingly steady, and added a little water from the bucket, stirring it into a cloudy paste with the tip of her finger. She carried it to the cot. Eli was stirring, his small body restless. "Eli, honey," she whispered, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. "You need to take this. It will make you feel better." He whimpered, turning his face away. Getting a sick child to take bitter medicine was a battle of wills she had fought before. She cradled his head, her voice a low, soothing murmur, promising him a spoonful of molasses afterward. She managed to get most of the mixture into him, his small face screwed up in distaste. As she settled him back onto the pillow, her eyes met the stranger's. He was watching her from the chair, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He looked away the moment their gazes met. Next was the cough syrup. The dark, thick balsam smelled strongly of pine and something else, something sharp and medicinal that spoke of potency. She heated some water by the fire and mixed a spoonful of the syrup into it, just as the apothecary's label instructed. The warm, aromatic steam filled the air, a scent of healing that was a welcome change from the room's odor of sickness and wet wool. She gave this to Eli as well, and this time he took it more easily, the warmth seeming to soothe the raw scrape in his throat. He settled into a quieter, though still troubled, sleep. For now, she had done all she could for her son. That left the other patient, the bleeding man who sat by her fire, a silent, brooding presence. His wet greatcoat was dripping a dirty puddle onto her clean-scrubbed floor, and the dark stain on his side seemed to have grown larger. Ignoring it was not an option. A festering wound in this cold could turn deadly in a matter of days. She hardened her heart, picked up a clean cloth and the bucket of heated water, and approached him. "I need to see to that wound," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He looked up, his deep-set eyes clouded with pain. He gave a slow, tired nod. "I'd be obliged. You'll need to get that coat off." Getting the heavy, frozen garment off him was a struggle. It was like peeling the bark from a tree. He helped as much as he could, his movements stiff and hindered, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips as the fabric pulled at the wound on his side. as the coat finally came away. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Around his waist was a worn leather gun belt, and holstered in it was a heavy Colt revolver, its wooden grip worn smooth from use. The sight of it was a jolt, a visceral reminder that this was no lost farmer. This was a man who lived with and by the gun. The fragile peace of the last hour evaporated, replaced by the cold, familiar sting of fear. He saw where she was looking. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled the belt. He held it out to her. "Grip first. You should hold on to this," he said, his voice a low rumble. Her hand trembled slightly as she took it. The belt was heavy, the pistol a solid, menacing weight. She carried it to the far side of the room and laid it on the high shelf of the cupboard, well out of his reach, and hers. Only then did she return to him. His shirt, a dark wool flannel, was soaked through with a mixture of melted snow and blood. "This will have to be cut," she said, retrieving a pair of sewing scissors. He simply nodded again, his jaw set. She cut away the cloth with efficient snips, revealing the injury beneath. It was a nasty sight. A bullet had torn a long, deep furrow along his ribs, ripping through flesh and muscle. It was raw and bleeding sluggishly, the edges already beginning to look inflamed. It was not a fatal wound. She assessed with a grim, frontier-bred practicality. But if infection set in, it would be... She dipped the cloth into the hot water, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against the wound. He flinched, his whole body going rigid, but he didn't make a sound. She cleaned it as best she could, her movements brisk and impersonal. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the man's controlled, pain-filled breaths. "Who did this to you?" she asked finally, her voice low and even. She needed to know. She had a right to know what kind of trouble she had let into her home. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes closed. "Men I used to know," he said at last. "And why were they after you?" she pressed, applying a fresh, hot cloth. He opened his eyes and looked at her. There was no deceit in them, only a profound weariness. "It's a long story, ma'am." "The storm isn't ending any time soon," she replied flatly. "And I've got a right to know the name of the man bleeding on my floor." He seemed to consider this, then sighed, a sound that was more of a surrender than a breath. "My name is Caleb, Caleb Cross." The name meant nothing to her, but then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Some used to call me the Black Cross." That she had heard. A name spoken in hushed tones in the general store back in Laramie. A name attached to stories of cattle disputes settled at gunpoint, of claim jumpers who vanished without a trace, of debts collected for wealthy, ruthless men with a finality that left no room for appeal. The Black Cross was a phantom, a bogeyman of the territories, a man who did the dirty work that so-called respectable men wanted done without getting their own hands soiled. Her blood ran cold. She was tending the wound of a monster from a fireside tale. She pulled back, the bloody rag in her hand. "You're him." He didn't flinch from her gaze. "I was," he said quietly. "I'm not that man anymore. That's what this is all about." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. His story, his claim of redemption, seemed too convenient, too perfectly crafted to be true. "Talk," she commanded, her voice betraying a tremor she could not conceal. And so he did. As she cleaned and bandaged his wound with strips of clean linen, he told his story in a low, halting voice. He spoke of a youth spent chasing a life he thought was freedom, only to find it was just another kind of cage. He told her of the things he had done for money, his voice devoid of pride or excuse. He'd been an enforcer, a man hired to intimidate and to punish. He didn't go into details, but the shadows that passed through his eyes told their own story. "A man gets to a point," he said, staring into the flames, "where he looks at his hands and he doesn't recognize them anymore. He hears his name and it sounds like a curse. I reached that point about a year ago. I rode away from it all. I swore I'd never draw a gun for money again." He explained that he had ended up in Cheyenne, doing odd jobs, trying to scrape together enough to buy a small plot of land, to build something instead of tearing things down. That's where he'd met the nun, Sister Mary Catherine. She ran a small mission and orphanage in the Wind River territory. Winter was coming on fast, and a shipment of medicine she had ordered was sitting in the apothecary, with no one willing to make the dangerous late-season trek to deliver it. She didn't have much to pay, Caleb said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. Just a promise of a hot meal and prayers for my soul. Seemed like a fair trade at the time. He had taken the job, but men from his past life, men he had once worked for and later defied, got wind that he was riding north. They assumed he hadn't changed his stripes, that he was carrying a payroll or gold. They'd been waiting for him in a narrow pass 2 days south of her cabin. It wasn't a fair fight, he said, his voice dropping. 3 of them. I didn't want any trouble, but they weren't interested in talking. He had managed to get away, but not before one of their bullets had found him. He'd been riding ever since, losing blood, the storm closing in on him. His only thought to keep moving, to get the medicine to where it was going. When he finished, silence once again filled the room. It was a good story, a powerful story of a man seeking redemption, complete with a holy nun, sick orphans, and treacherous villains. It was, Sarah thought with a cynical twist in her gut, exactly the sort of story a man like Caleb, the Black Cross's cross, would tell a lone woman whose trust he needed to gain. She didn't believe him, not completely. She finished tying off the bandage, her work neat and tight. You rest, she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. She stood up and moved away from him, creating a safe distance between them once more. Hours passed. The storm continued its relentless assault on the cabin. Caleb dozed fitfully in the chair, his face pale and etched with pain. Sarah sat in her own chair, the rifle on her lap, watching him, watching her son. The pine balsam seemed to be working. Eli's breathing was deeper. The terrible wheezing faded to a quiet rattle. Sometime in the deepest, darkest part of the night, Eli began to cough in his sleep. It was a harsh, dry sound. He whimpered, his fevered mind trapped in a bad dream. Before Sarah could even rise from her chair, Caleb was awake. His eyes snapped open, instantly alert. He listened for a moment, his head cocked. Then, with a pained grunt, he pushed himself up from the chair. He limped to the water bucket, his movements slow and agonizing. He filled a tin cup and carried it carefully over to the cot. Sarah tensed, her hand tightening on the rifle, but he didn't reach for the boy. He simply knelt by the bedside. "Easy now, son," he murmured, his voice a low, gentle rumble that was nothing like the rasping whisper of before. Just a bad dream. Eli's eyes fluttered open. He looked at the large, bearded stranger looming over him, not with fear, but with the dazed confusion of a sick child. "You're thirsty," Caleb stated simply. "This'll help that cough." He held the cup out. "Your mama's right here. It's all right." He waited patiently as Eli, with some effort, pushed himself up and took a few sips of the cool water. Caleb's large, calloused hand, a hand that had held a gun and likely ended lives, rested gently on the cot's wooden frame, not touching the boy, but simply there, a steady, solid presence. Sarah watched from the shadows, mesmerized. There was no deceit in this moment. There was no audience to perform for. Other than a woman who held him at gunpoint, this was an unthinking act of simple kindness. She looked at his face, softened by the dim light and the concern he showed for her son, and she saw something that didn't fit the legend of the Black Cross. The rumors spoke of a cold, ruthless man, but the man kneeling by her son's sickbed, murmuring soothing words, seemed to be someone else entirely. For the first time since she had heard his horse's hoofbeats, a sliver of doubt pierced her certainty. She had heard the stories, the dark whispers of his past, but what she was seeing with her own eyes was something different, She was seeing a ghost, perhaps, but she wasn't sure if it was the ghost of the killer he once was, or the ghost of the good man he was trying to become. The blizzard did not break. It settled. The violent, shrieking winds lessened to a persistent, mournful howl, and the snow, which had driven down in a solid, blinding sheet, softened to a steady, silent fall of thick, heavy flakes. The world outside the cabin was transformed into a place of profound and beautiful desolation. Drifts sculpted by the wind rose in soft, white waves as high as the cabin's roof, burying the familiar landscape under a thick, pristine blanket. For 3 more days, the snow fell, sealing the tiny cabin and its 3 occupants away from the rest of the world as effectively as if they had been set adrift on a white and silent sea. Time within the cabin walls took on a new rhythm. The days were no longer marked by the rising and setting of a sun they could not see, but by a series of small, domestic rituals. The first and most important of these was the medicine. Twice a day, Sarah would administer the fever powders and the pine balsam syrup to Eli. The change in the boy was nothing short of miraculous. By the 2nd day, his fever had broken, leaving him weak and sweat-soaked but clear-eyed for the first time in a week. The terrible, wheezing cough subsided, replaced by a looser, healthier sound. The life that Sarah had feared was slipping away was returning to him, and every clear breath he took was a quiet testament to the stranger in her rocking chair. Gratitude was a powerful and complicated emotion. It did not erase her fear, but it forced it to retreat, to take a watchful position in the back of her mind. She still kept Caleb's gun belt on the high shelf, a silent acknowledgement of the unknown history that lay between them. But she no longer clutched her rifle every time he moved. Caleb, for his part, was an unobtrusive guest. He seemed to understand the fragility of his position and took up as little space as possible, both physically and emotionally. He never spoke of his past again, nor did he ask about hers. He spent most of the first day resting, the wound in his side forcing a pained stillness upon him. But as his strength began to return, a restless energy grew in him. He was not a man built for idle confinement. On the 3rd morning, Sarah awoke to find him already dressed, staring at the meager pile of firewood beside the hearth. "That won't last another day," he stated, his voice a low rumble in the quiet of the dawn. "It will have to," she replied, ladling water into the coffee pot. "There's no getting to the wood pile through that snow." He said nothing, simply pulled on his stiff boots and retrieved his frozen greatcoat. Before she could protest, he had opened the door and stepped out into the frigid, waist-deep snow on the porch. He found the long-handled axe leaning against the wall and began the laborious task of carving a path toward the wood pile, a dark shape of determined motion against the overwhelming white. Sarah watched him from the window, a protest dying on her lips. He moved with a pained, deliberate slowness, favoring his injured side, but his actions were efficient and sure. He dug out the splitting stump, cleared the snow from the logs, and began to work. The rhythmic sound of the axe splitting wood, a solid, resonant thwack, followed by the sharp crack of parting timber, became the new heartbeat of their isolated world. It was a sound of provision, of purpose, of a man's strength being put to use not for violence, but for the simple, fundamental task of creating warmth. Each log he split was a piece of the future, a guarantee of another few hours of life and comfort against the encroaching cold. As she watched his broad back and the steady rise and fall of the axe, she felt a flicker of something she had not felt in a very long time, the quiet reassurance of not being entirely alone in the fight for survival. He worked for an hour before coming back inside, his face flushed from the cold and exertion, his breathing heavy. He stacked the fresh, sweet-smelling pine by the hearth without a word and sank into his chair, a sheen of sweat on his brow despite the chill. Sarah poured him a cup of hot coffee and set it on the small table beside him. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. The next day, a brief lull in the storm revealed new damage. The wind had torn a section of wooden shingles from the roof near the chimney, leaving a dark patch that would be a welcome mat for leaks when the great melt came, before she had even had a chance to worry about it. Caleb was assessing the problem. "There are some spare shingles behind the woodpile," she said, almost apologetically. "I've never been able to fix the roof myself." "I can manage it," he said. It was a cooperative effort. She found the old hammer and a small bag of nails while he, with great care, climbed the snow-covered woodpile to get onto the low, sloping roof. She stood on the porch below, handing the tools and shingles up to him. Their fingers brushed as he took a nail from her hand, his touch calloused and surprisingly warm against her cold skin. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a small, unexpected jolt through her. She pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing. For the rest of the task, she simply placed the items on the edge of the roof for him to retrieve, flustered by a simple touch in a way she hadn't been since she was a young girl. But the most profound shift happened not between Sarah and Caleb, but between Caleb and Eli. As the boy's strength returned, so did his boundless 7-year-old energy. Confined to the cabin, he quickly grew bored. He watched the big, quiet stranger with a wide-eyed, fearless curiosity. Caleb, in turn, seemed to be quietly aware of the boy's every move. One afternoon, while Sarah was kneading bread dough, she watched as Eli approached the hearth where Caleb was sitting, examining the wound on his side. "Did that hurt?" Eli asked, his voice clear and direct. Sarah tensed, ready to scold the boy for his impertinence, but Caleb just looked at Eli, a faint smile touching his lips. "It did," he said. "Hurts less now. My papa worked in a mine," Eli offered, suddenly conversational. "He got hurt once. A rock fell on his leg, but he was strong." Caleb's expression softened. "I'm sure he was," he said gently. "A man who has a family to care for is the strongest kind of man there is." From that moment, the barrier between them was gone. Later that day, Sarah saw Caleb take a flat piece of kindling and a lump of charcoal from the hearth. He carefully drew a grid of 64 squares onto the wood. Then he and Eli went on a hunt through the stone-lined hearth, collecting small, flat pebbles, 8 dark gray ones and 8 that were lighter, almost white. "This is a game called checkers," Caleb explained. Setting up the board on the floor between them, he began to explain the simple rules, his deep voice patient and calm. Soon, the cabin was filled with the soft click of stones on wood and the new, wonderful sound of Eli's laughter as he captured one of Caleb's pieces. "King me," the boy would shout in triumph, his face alight with a joy that had been absent for too long. Sarah found herself pausing in her work, her hands coated in flour, just to watch them. She would sit in her rocking chair, a mending basket in her lap, and observe them for hours. Caleb was a surprisingly good teacher. He was patient, he never grew frustrated, and he explained his moves to the boy, teaching him strategy. He let Eli win, but not every time, making the boy's victories feel earned and real. In these moments, Caleb Cross was not the fearsome gunfighter of rumor. He was just a man, finding a simple, quiet joy in the company of a child. A strange and unfamiliar feeling began to stir in Sarah's chest. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It spread slowly, tentatively, through a part of her heart she thought had been frozen solid 4 years ago, on the day the news from the mine had come. After Thomas's death, her love had narrowed, focusing its entire fierce intensity on Eli. There was no room for anything else. Her world was about duty, memory, and survival. Now, that world was being disturbed. She found her eyes lingering on Caleb. She noticed the way the firelight caught the graying hair at his temples, the network of fine lines around his eyes that crinkled when he smiled at Eli, the sheer size of his hands, which could be so surprisingly gentle. She would listen to the low cadence of his voice as he told Eli a story about a coyote that thought it could outsmart a badger, and a pleasant shiver would run down her spine. It frightened her. It felt like a betrayal, a disloyalty to the memory of the good, steady man she had loved and lost. Thomas had been her beginning and her end. But the feeling, this new budding awareness of the man who had fallen into her life, was persistent. It was a tiny, green shoot pushing its way through frozen ground, a testament to the stubborn, unyielding power of life itself. Her heart, which she had guarded so fiercely for 4 long years, was beginning to feel the first tentative signs of a thaw. The world was born anew in silence and blinding white. On the 5th morning, the snow stopped, the wind died, and a profound stillness settled over the land, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, as if the air itself is weighted down with snow. A pale winter sun climbed into the sky, and its light struck the landscape with a brilliant, almost painful intensity, transforming the sculpted drifts into glittering mountains of diamond dust. The only sound was the gentle, rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves as the sun began its slow, relentless work. Inside the cabin, the oppressive sense of confinement had lifted, replaced by a tentative, shared relief. The atmosphere had become one of quiet domesticity, an unspoken routine built in the space between danger and survival. After a breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, Caleb was sitting on the floor by the hearth, showing Eli how to carve a sliver of pine into the rough shape of a bird with a small, sharp knife. His large hands, which Sarah now knew could be both deadly and gentle, moved with a surprising dexterity, peeling away thin curls of wood to reveal the form within. Sarah watched them from the table, a small, genuine smile on her lips as she mended a tear in Eli's trousers. The sound of her son's quiet questions and Caleb's low, patient answers was a balm in this small bubble of warmth and light. It was possible to forget the world outside, to forget the pasts that haunted them. It was possible to imagine, just for a moment, that this was simply a family, waiting out the winter. It was the horse that warned them. Caleb's bay, sheltered in the lean-to, let out a low, nervous whinny. Caleb's head snapped up, his hands instantly still. Every trace of the gentle teacher vanished, replaced by the alert, watchful stillness of a wolf sensing danger. He and Sarah locked eyes across the small room. In the profound silence left by the storm, they heard it at the same time, a faint, rhythmic crunching, the sound of hooves on deep snow. It was not one horse, it was several, and they were coming closer. The fragile peace of the morning shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Get back from the window," Caleb said, his voice a low, urgent command. He was already on his feet, moving with a pained stiffness toward the door. His eyes narrowed. "How many?" Sarah, her heart suddenly a cold, hammering drum in her chest, scurried to the side of the window and peered through a small gap. 3 riders, black figures stark against the dazzling snow, were making their way slowly up the path her own tracks had begun to forge. They were still some distance away, but their destination was unmistakable. 3 of them, she breathed, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. "One has a star on his chest, a lawman." Caleb swore under his breath, a sharp, bitter sound. He looked around the cabin, a caged animal seeking an escape that didn't exist. "My gun," he said, his eyes flicking to the high shelf. "No," Sarah said immediately, her voice sharp with a fear that was part of a sudden, desperate clarity. "A gun will only make it worse. They'll see you're armed and they'll have all the reason they need." She moved toward him, her mind racing faster than it ever had. "You're my cousin, from back east. Your name is Silas. You were caught in the storm. Your horse threw you. You're hurt. Understand?" He stared at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and grim understanding. He saw the desperate resolve in her eyes. This was her home, her territory. Here, he had to follow her lead. He gave a single sharp nod. "Silas," he repeated, testing the name. "Eli," Sarah said, turning to her son, who was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. "This is our visitor, Mr. Silas. He's your cousin. If anyone asks, that's who he is. Can you remember that?" The boy nodded solemnly, his lower lip trembling slightly. Sarah's heart ached for him, but there was no time for comfort. She took Caleb's gun belt from the shelf and shoved it deep into her bedding chest. Kicking a blanket over it, she turned back to Caleb. "You need to look the part. Sit, look weak." He didn't need much acting. He sank back into the rocking chair by the fire, his face pale with a combination of his actual pain and the tension of the moment. As the riders drew closer, Sarah recognized the other two men, and her blood ran even colder. One was Reverend Michael, whose pious gaze always seemed to be searching for sin. The other was the man who was, for all intents and purposes, the leader of the nearest settlement, Mr. Alistair Finch, a man of property and influence, a widower in his 50s with a self-important air and small, shrewd eyes. A man who had made his interest in the widow Duval clear on more than one occasion, an interest Sarah had politely but firmly rebuffed. His presence here was not a comfort. It was a threat of a different kind. She took a deep breath, grabbed her old Winchester not as a threat, but as the familiar accessory of a woman alone on the frontier, and stepped out onto the porch. She pulled the door partway shut behind her, shielding the cabin's interior from immediate view. The three men reined in their horses a few yards from her porch. The steam plumed from the animals' nostrils in the cold, clear air. "Mrs. Duval," Alistair Finch said, swinging down from his saddle. He removed his hat, revealing a balding head, his smile a tight, proprietary thing. "Sarah, we were nigh sick with worry. A storm like that. We had to come and make sure you and the boy were safe." "We're fine, Mr. Finch," Sarah said, her voice steady. She kept her eyes on him, but she was acutely aware of Sheriff Brody, who remained in his saddle, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, the lean-to, the tracks in the snow. He was a tall, lean man with a face like tanned leather, and his eyes missed nothing. A terrible trial for a woman on her own. The Reverend intoned, his voice smooth and sanctimonious. "The Lord has surely watched over this house." "We managed," Sarah said, her grip tightening on the rifle stock. "We saw the tracks," Sheriff Brody said, his voice a dry rasp that cut through the pleasantries. "And the extra horse in the lean-to. Figured you had company." His eyes were hard, questioning. This was not a social call. This was an interrogation. The moment had come. Sarah forced a weary, slightly strained expression to her face. "My cousin, Silas," she said, the lie feeling clumsy and foreign on her tongue. "He was traveling from the east when the storm hit. His horse threw him, and he was in a bad way. He managed to make it here the first night of the blizzard." Finch's smile tightened. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Your cousin," he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "I don't recall you ever mentioning family out this way." "Sarah." "A distant cousin, on my mother's side. She invented, praying her face wasn't betraying her. I hadn't seen him since I was a girl." As if on cue, the cabin door creaked open further, and Caleb appeared in the opening. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, one hand pressed to his bandaged side. He looked pale, disheveled, and convincingly weak. He squinted into the bright snow, a flicker of pain, real or feigned, crossing his features. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, taking in every detail of the tall, wounded man. "That's a bad spill you took, friend," Brody said, his voice holding no sympathy. "I've had better days," Caleb rasped, playing his part, grateful to my cousin for taking me in. "I'd have been a dead man otherwise." Alistair Finch's gaze moved from Caleb's worn, rugged face to Sarah's, and his eyes were full of a cold, possessive fury. He saw not an injured relative, but a rival, a usurper. "Indeed," Finch said, his voice silky smooth. "Providence is a mysterious thing. It is a great burden for Sarah to have to nurse not only her sick son, but a wounded traveler as well. A burden a man should be here to shoulder." His meaning was unmistakable. Eli is much better. Thank you, Sarah said coolly, cutting him off. And my cousin is no burden. The sheriff ignored their exchange. His focus was entirely on Caleb. Silas, you say, what's your family name? Parker, Caleb answered without hesitation. And where you headed? Mr. Parker. California, Caleb said. Got word of work in the goldfields. The story was thin, plausible, but thin. Sarah could feel the weight of their disbelief, a heavy, suffocating pressure. The sheriff's eyes lingered on Caleb's face. You look familiar, Brody said slowly. Have we met? Don't believe so. Sheriff, Caleb replied, his voice steady. I keep to myself mostly. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations. The bright sunlit day felt charged, dangerous, as if a single wrong word could cause an explosion. Finally, the sheriff gathered his reins. He had no proof, no cause to push further. For now. Well, Mrs. Duval, he said, his gaze returning to her. Glad to see you're safe. We'll be passing back this way in a few days, checking on the other homesteads. He looked pointedly at Caleb. I expect your cousin will be fit to travel by then. The trails should be clear. It was not a suggestion. It was an order. I'm sure he will be, Sarah said, her heart sinking. Finch put his hat back on, his expression grim. You know my door is always open if you need proper assistance. Sarah, he said, the word proper, heavy with insinuation. He swung back onto his horse, gave Caleb one last, withering look, and turned his horse around. Sarah and Caleb stood on the porch, watching them ride away. They didn't speak until the three dark figures had disappeared over a white rise, leaving nothing behind but deep tracks in the snow. They went back inside, and Sarah threw the bar across the door, the sound echoing the sudden closing off of her own heart. The warmth and peace of the morning were gone, replaced by a chilling dread. The safe, isolated world she had built within these four walls had been breached. The law, the church, and the jealous ambitions of a powerful man had come to her door, and they had left a shadow behind them. She looked at Caleb, who was staring at the door, his face a hard mask. The budding tenderness that had been growing between them was now overshadowed by the stark reality of their situation. They were no longer just a widow and a stranger. They were conspirators, and they both knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that the men who had just left would be back. The departure of the three riders left a poison in the air. The vast, silent beauty of the snow-covered world outside the window no longer felt like a protective blanket, but like the stark white page on which a terrible story was about to be written. The warmth of the cabin, which had become a sanctuary, now felt fragile, a temporary illusion that could be shattered at any moment. A heavy silence descended between Sarah and Caleb, thick with the things they could not say in front of Eli. They went through the motions of the evening, a pantomime of the domestic peace they had so recently found. Sarah prepared a simple supper of rabbit stew, the familiar task a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Caleb sat by the fire, sharpening his small carving knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic, scraping sound a nervous, unsettling counterpoint to the crackling flames. He was no longer relaxed, but coiled, his back to the wall, his eyes constantly flicking towards the shuttered window as if he could see the coming threat through the solid wood. Eli, with the uncanny sensitivity of a child, felt the shift. His usual dinner-time chatter was replaced by a subdued quiet. He ate his stew, his gaze moving between his mother's taut face and the grim set of Caleb's jaw. He seemed to understand that the world had changed, that the game of Cousin Silas's was no game at all. After the meal, Sarah put Eli to bed. She sat on the edge of his cot for a long time in the dim light, humming a lullaby her own mother used to sing, her hand resting on his small back until his breathing deepened into the steady, even rhythm of sleep. It was a small, precious peace, a reminder of what was at stake. Everything she did, every choice she made, Was for this the safety of her son, sleeping soundly in his bed? When she finally rose, the cabin was quiet except for the sigh of the wind in the chimney and the low hiss of the fire. Caleb was still at the table, a mug of coffee untouched in front of him. The oil lamp cast a small, lonely circle of golden light around him, leaving the corners of the room in deep shadow. He looked up as she approached, his face a mask of grim resolve. She sat down opposite him, the small wooden table feeling like a vast, empty canyon between them. The silence was no longer awkward. It was charged, heavy with the weight of the day and the choices that lay ahead. It was Caleb who broke it. "I'll be gone before first light," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He did not look at her, but stared into the dark liquid in his mug. "I won't bring this trouble down on you. I'll head north, draw them away from here." It was the honorable thing to say, the noble sacrifice, and it infuriated her. And then what she asked, her voice tight, sharp. "How far do you think you'll get with that wound? In snow this deep, Brody's no fool. He'll track you down before you've gone 10 miles, or the cold will do his job for him. Is that your plan, to die honorably in a snowbank?" He looked up, a flash of surprise in his weary eyes. "It's better than staying," he said, his voice rough. "It's better than putting you and the boy in the path of men like that." "Men like Finch?" "You mean," she countered, a bitter edge to her tone. "You think your leaving makes us safer, mister. Finch has wanted this land, and its widow, since the day my husband was buried. He sees me as a problem to be solved, a property to be managed. Your presence here is a complication for him, but your absence, that's an invitation. If they come back and find my mysterious cousin has vanished into thin air, what story do you think Finch will tell? He'll say you were a fugitive I was harboring. He'll use it as proof that I'm an unfit mother, that this place is unsafe for a child." The color drained from Caleb's face as the truth of her words settled in. His leaving wouldn't save them. It would only leave them defenseless. "I've brought a curse on this house," he whispered, his broad shoulders slumping. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing so profound it was like a physical wound. "I should have died in that snow. It would have been better for everyone." "Eli would be dead if you had," she said softly, the anger draining out of her, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. He flinched as if she had struck him. He looked down at his hands, spread flat on the tabletop. They were large, capable hands, calloused from hard work and harder living. "You see me sitting here, playing checkers with your boy, mending your roof," he said, his voice thick with shame, "and you think you see a man. You don't. You see a disguise. You don't know what these hands have done. Sarah, the things I've been paid to do." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper. "There's a reason they call me the Black Cross. It's not just a name, it's a brand. It's for the mark I left on men and the one they left on my soul. There's blood in my past, so much of it I sometimes think I'll never be warm again. For years, I haven't had a single night's sleep that wasn't filled with the faces of men I've hurt, men I've—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "This place," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the warm, fire-lit room, "listening to you hum to your boy, seeing him smile. It's like a drink of clean water to a man dying of thirst. But I have no right to it. I'm a thief, sitting by a good man's fire, pretending I belong. I am not the kind of man who builds a life like this. I'm the kind who burns it down." His confession hung in the air, a testament to his own brokenness, his own profound sense of being unworthy of the sanctuary he had found. Sarah listened, her heart aching for him. She heard every word, saw the deep, genuine pain in his eyes, and it did not scare her. All she saw was a man who had been lost for a very long time, a man who believed he was beyond saving. Slowly, deliberately, she reached across the table, her hand, small and scarred from lye soap and hard work, covered his. His skin was rough, but warm. He flinched at her touch, his gaze snapping up to meet hers, his eyes wide with a vulnerable, shocked expression. My husband, Thomas, was a good man, she said, her voice quiet but strong, a thread of steel running through the softness. He was kind and decent. He never hurt a soul in his life. He built this cabin with his own 2 hands, and he loved me and Eli more than anything. And then one day, there was a methane blast in the mine, and all his goodness couldn't stop the mountain from falling on him. For 4 years, I've been alone, and let me tell you, Caleb, his goodness was a cold comfort on nights when the wind was trying to tear the roof off, or when I heard a rider in the distance and had to sit by the door with a rifle in my lap until dawn. She tightened her grip on his hand. I'm not a young girl with foolish dreams anymore. I know what this world is. It's hard, and it's cruel, and it doesn't care if you're a good man or a bad one. It just takes what it wants. She leaned in, her gaze holding his, her voice dropping to an intense, heartfelt whisper. I don't need a perfect man, scraped clean of his past. I've learned there's no such thing out here. I need a man who stays. I need a man who isn't afraid of the dark. I need a man who will stand between my son and men like Alistair Finch. Tears welled in Caleb's eyes, and he did not try to hide them. He stared at her plain, strong face, at the unwavering resolve in her eyes. He was seeing an acceptance he had never believed was possible, a forgiveness he was certain he didn't deserve. Slowly, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, his grip firm and sure. Sarah, he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was part gratitude, part awe. The shadows that had haunted his face seemed to recede, chased away by the small, steady light in her eyes. If you're telling me that you see the man I am, and not just the one I was, if you're telling me you want me to stay. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a man pulling himself back from the edge of a cliff. Then I'll stay, he vowed, his voice gaining strength and a fierce, ringing conviction. I'll never leave. If Finch and that sheriff come back, they'll have to tear this cabin down to the last log to get me out of it. I swear it. They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped across the table, the oil lamp burning steadily between them. The promise hung in the air, real and solid. The storm outside was over, but a new one was gathering. This time, however, they would not be facing it alone. The promise made in the quiet of the night did not banish the fear, but it changed its nature. It was no longer the solitary, gnawing dread of a woman alone, but a shared burden, a watchfulness that passed between 2 people in a single glance. The days that followed were a strange mixture of idyllic peace and taut anticipation. The snow began to recede under the relentless winter sun, revealing the dark, wet earth in patches. The world was slowly, cautiously, re-emerging. Inside the cabin, a new kind of normal took root. Caleb's presence was no longer a temporary arrangement, but a given. He worked from sunup to sundown, his energy fueled by a fierce, protective purpose. He secured the repaired roof shingles. He cleared a wide path to the woodpile and the stream, and he began the arduous task of digging out the fences. He moved like a man who was not just earning his keep, but building a life, staking a claim not on the land, but on the small family within the cabin walls. The intimacy between him and Sarah grew in the quiet moments. A shared cup of coffee in the morning, a brief touch of hands as she passed him a plate, a quiet conversation after Eli was asleep. They spoke not of the future, which was a terrifying unknown, but of the past, filling in the empty spaces of each other's lives. She told him about Thomas, about their dreams of buying more land, about the crushing silence after his death. He, in turn, told her of his own childhood on a failed farm in Missouri, of the hunger that had first led him to a life of violence, and of the profound, soul-deep weariness that had finally led him to try and leave it. Their bond was forged not in flowery words, but in the shared labor of survival and the unspoken understanding of 2 wounded souls finding refuge in one another. For the first time in 4 years, Sarah felt the stirrings of hope, a fragile but persistent warmth in her chest. The outside world returned on the 4th day, not with the thunder of Sheriff Brody's posse, but with the quiet, methodical clip-clop of a single horse. It was a young deputy, barely old enough to have a beard, and his face was set in an expression of official neutrality. He did not ask to come in. He simply touched the brim of his hat, handed Sarah a thick, folded document bearing the official seal of the Wyoming Territorial Circuit Court, and rode away, leaving the document in her hand like a ticking bomb. Her hands trembled as she carried it inside. Caleb looked up from where he was showing Eli how to tie a knot, his face immediately grim. He knew what it was. They both did. She waited until Eli was engrossed in his task. Then she sat at the table and broke the wax seal. Caleb stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent, steadying weight. The document was a petition to the court, written in a clerk's ornate, looping hand. But the words themselves were the cold, cruel venom of Alistair Finch. She read it aloud, her voice growing thinner, more brittle with each line. The petition was a masterpiece of righteous, legalistic cruelty. It named her Sarah Duval as the sole guardian of her minor son, Eli. It then went on to state that a concerned citizen, Alistair Finch, had reason to believe the child was in a state of immediate and profound peril. The words were like stones, each one striking a fresh blow. It described the presence of an unknown transient, a man of violent and questionable character living in the home. It twisted her desperate act of mercy into a sign of wanton recklessness. It painted a picture of her as a lonely, foolish widow who had allowed a dangerous drifter to install himself in her home, thereby exposing her son to moral corruption and the constant threat of physical harm. But it was the final paragraph that stole the air from her lungs. It formally petitioned Judge Patterson to issue an order removing Eli Duval from her custody, for his own safety and welfare. It requested that the boy be placed into the temporary guardianship of a more suitable, God-fearing family with the means to provide a stable and proper Christian upbringing. The petition concluded by noting that Mr. and Mrs. Abernathy, pillars of the local church and close friends of Mr. Finch, had already graciously volunteered to take the boy in. The document fell from her fingers onto the table. They were trying to take her son. It was not a threat of violence, of robbery, or of the dangers of the frontier she had always feared. It was something far worse. It was the law itself, the very structure of society, being turned into a weapon to tear her child from her arms. It was a clean, bloodless, and utterly devastating attack. All her strength, all her resilience, all the hardness she had cultivated to survive on her own, crumbled into dust. A low, wounded sound escaped her throat, and she buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with a despair so absolute it felt like a physical death. She had fought the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, the fear, but she did not know how to fight this. How could she stand in a courtroom and prove she was a good mother against the powerful, respected voice of Alistair Finch? How could she explain Caleb, a man with a past that would curdle the blood of any judge, a man whose real name was a curse? They had found her weakest point and driven a legal spear straight through it. Caleb's hand tightened on her shoulder. He was silent for a long time, his fury a palpable, radiating heat in the small room. She could feel him wrestling with his own violent instincts, with the urge to ride into town and settle this the old way, a way that would only serve to prove Finch's every accusation true. When he finally moved, his actions were slow, deliberate. He gently pulled her hands from her face. He picked up the petition, folded it neatly, and placed it on the mantelpiece, as if to rob it of its power by refusing to look at it. Then he knelt before her chair. He took both of her trembling hands in his grip firm and grounding. He waited until her ragged sobs subsided and she looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow with defeat. "This isn't about you being a bad mother. Sarah," he said, his voice low and intense, stripped of all but a raw, powerful conviction. "You're the best mother I've ever seen. This is about you being a woman alone, That's all Finch and Brody see. They see an unowned property, an unprotected claim. This petition, it's not because I'm here. It's because I'm not your husband. She stared at him, not understanding. They've built their case on our arrangement being improper, he continued, his gaze holding hers, forcing her to see the cold logic. An unmarried woman, living with a man who is not her kin. In their eyes, in the eyes of a judge, that's all the proof they need that this is an unstable home. They are using the law against you, so we have to use the law to fight back. He took a deep breath, his knuckles white where he gripped her hands. This was not the hesitant, haunted man who had confessed his sins to her by firelight. This was a man with a purpose, a man who saw the path through the darkness. "If you marry me, Sarah," he said, the words clear and steady in the quiet room, "you won't be a lone widow anymore. You'll be my wife. This cabin will be a legal household, a proper family home. Finch's accusations of impropriety, of moral danger, they'll turn to dust. The law gives a man the right to live under his own roof with his wife and his son. They would have no grounds to stand on." Sarah's mind reeled. Marriage, it was a desperate, insane solution, a legal fiction to solve a legal threat. She started to pull her hands away, to tell him it was impossible. But he held on, his grip gentle but firm. "Look at me," he said softly. He waited until her eyes met his again. The hardness was gone from his face, replaced by an expression of such raw, vulnerable honesty that it made her heart ache. "This isn't just about the law for me, Sarah," he said, his voice growing thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "These last weeks, watching you with Eli, sharing this home, it's been more of a life than I've had in 20 years. You've given me a reason to wake up in the morning that isn't just about surviving another day." He brought her hands to his chest, pressing them against the steady beat of his heart. "If you'll have me, if you'll be my wife, you'll be giving me something I never dared to even dream of, something I was sure I'd forfeited the right to long ago. A family, a home, a reason." He was not just offering her a shield. He was offering her his whole, battered, and broken heart. He was asking not just to be her protector, but to be her husband, not just for the sake of the law, but for the sake of the life they had accidentally, miraculously, started to build together. Tears streamed down her face again, but they were no longer tears of despair. She looked at the man kneeling before her, a man who had come to her as a wounded stranger and had become her anchor, her partner, and her fierce protector. In his eyes, she saw not a solution to a legal problem, but the answer to the loneliness that had haunted her for 4 long years. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. Yes, it was not a word of breathless, romantic joy. It was a word spoken from the depths of a desperate, cornered fear, a word that was less an acceptance of a proposal and more the grasping of the only available weapon. Sarah spoke it in a near whisper, her gaze locked on Caleb's, and in his eyes, she saw not triumph, but the solemn, heavy weight of the vow he had just made. He was offering her a shield, and she was accepting it, knowing that the shield itself was scarred and battered and might not be strong enough to withstand the coming blow. The immediate aftermath was not a tender embrace, but a council of war. The haze of emotion cleared, replaced by the stark, cold light of practicality. "A marriage requires a preacher," she said, her voice flat, her mind already working through the impossible logistics. "Reverend Michael would sooner see me burn than see me married to you. He's Finch's man, through and through. There's a town 2 days' ride from here." "Rock Creek," Caleb said, rising from his knees, his mind now focused on the tactical problem before them. "There's a man of God there, an old circuit preacher. He's a fair man. He'll ask questions, but he'll listen to the answers." 2 days, Sarah repeated, the words tasting like ash. "We don't know how much time we have. Finch and Brody won't wait forever, leaving me and Eli here alone." "I wouldn't," Caleb said immediately, his voice a hard, flat certainty. We all go. We pack what we can on my horse. You and the boy can ride. I'll walk alongside. We'll be slower, but we'll be together. It was a desperate, foolhardy plan. To travel the open country, exposed and vulnerable, with a child in tow. It seemed like madness, but staying felt like a surrender. For 2 days, a tense, frantic energy filled the cabin. They lived on a knife's edge of hope and dread. They spoke in low tones, making plans, always aware of Eli's presence, trying to shield him from the true depth of their fear. Sarah packed a small bundle of clothes, the fever medicines, and the last of her dried meat. Caleb spent his time outside, checking the shoes on his horse, mending a weak spot in the saddle's cinch, preparing his animal for a journey it might not be strong enough to make. Every gust of wind, every snap of a branch in the thawing woods, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They were waiting for the sound of hoofbeats, for the return of the law. It came on the afternoon of the second day. Again. It was the lone deputy. He rode up the muddy path, his horse's hooves making a sucking sound in the wet earth. This time, he did not dismount. He seemed to carry an air of grim finality, his young face impassive, his eyes avoiding Sarah's as she stepped out onto the porch. Caleb had been inside, checking the new bandage on his side, and he appeared in the doorway behind her, his large frame a dark, protective shadow. The deputy handed her another folded paper. It was not a petition this time. It was an order. A writ stamped with the same territorial seal. But this document was starker, its language brutal and absolute. It was a formal writ of removal. It stated that he, pursuant to the petition filed by Mr. Alastair Finch and in the considered opinion of Judge Patterson, the court found sufficient cause to believe that the minor child, Eli Duval, was residing in an environment detrimental to his physical safety and moral well-being. The words were a physical blow. Sarah's hands began to shake so violently she could barely hold the paper. The writ authorized Sheriff Brody to take the child into protective custody and deliver him to the appointed guardians. The final, terrible sentence was a death knell to their desperate plan. A marshal's escort will arrive at this location in 3 days' time, at noon, to execute this order. 3 days. The world tilted on its axis. The deputy had already turned his horse and was riding away. His duty done, he was just a messenger, a boy delivering a sentence he had not written. Sarah stumbled back into the cabin, the paper clutched in her fist. She sank into a chair at the table, staring at the wall, her eyes unseeing. The plan to ride to Rock Creek was a fantasy, a child's dream. In 3 days, they would be here. Not just the sheriff, but a marshal's escort, federal law, men with rifles and an unshakable belief in the righteousness of their cause, all coming to take her son. The fight went out of her, the strength that had carried her through widowhood, through the blizzard, through the first threat. It all dissolved into a cold, liquid pool of terror in her stomach. She had been a fool to think she could stand against men like Finch, a fool to think that a man like Caleb, a man with a past as dark as a winter midnight, could be her salvation. His presence was the very thing that had brought this doom upon them. "It's over," she whispered, the words ragged, torn from her throat. "There's no running, there's no preacher, there's no time." She looked up at Caleb, and for the first time, she looked at him not with budding affection, but with the raw agony of her despair. "They're going to take my son. They're going to take him because of you." The accusation, born of pure, unadulterated terror, struck him with the force of a physical blow. The color drained from his face. He took a half step back, the pain in his eyes so profound it was as if she had stabbed him. But then, a deep, unyielding resolve settled over his features. He had promised to stay. He had promised to be the man who did not run. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and knelt before her again. He did not touch her. He simply waited until her gaze, full of blame and despair, met his. "Yes," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her swirling vortex of panic. They are using me as the reason, but that doesn't mean we let them win. 3 days is not no time. Sarah, it's a lifetime. We don't have to outrun them forever. We just have to outrun this piece of paper." He reached out and gently, irresistibly, pried the writ from her clenched fist. He held it up. "This is ink on paper. It has power because men agree that it does. A marriage certificate is also ink on paper. It has a power that is older and stronger. We can still do this." How she cried, her voice breaking. "They'll be watching the trails. We'll never make it to Rock Creek." "Then we don't go to Rock Creek," he said, his mind working, calculating, refusing to surrender. "We go east, towards the Laramie Range. There's an old mission up in the foothills, the one Sister Mary Catherine runs, the one I was riding for. It's a hard ride. Through country they won't expect us to travel. But if we can get there, she'll help us. She'll know a priest who will give us shelter, who will marry us. We leave tonight, under the cover of darkness." His certainty was a force of nature. It did not erase her fear, but it pushed against it, creating a small space for a sliver of hope to enter. He was not giving up. He was not backing down. He was taking the law, the threat, the whole impossible situation, and he was staring it down, looking for the one small crack he could use to break it apart. She looked at him, truly looked at him, kneeling on her floor, his face etched with a fierce determination, his entire being focused on defending her son, and in that moment, her memory threw her back to that first night, the night of the storm. She could feel it again, the bone-deep cold, the howl of the wind, the heavy weight of the Winchester in her hands. She remembered standing in the shadows, her heart hammering with a primal fear of the unknown man on the other side of her door. She remembered the prayer she had whispered, a desperate plea born of pain and loss and a fierce, lonely need to protect what was hers. "Please don't come inside." She had seen him as the embodiment of all the world's dangers, a threat to be kept out at all costs. He was the darkness, the violence, the chaos that she had to keep from crossing her threshold. Now, he was here. He was inside. And the darkness was no longer embodied in him. It was in the cruel, legalistic words on a piece of paper. It was in the cold, possessive eyes of Alistair Finch. It was in the armed men who were riding to tear her family apart. The danger was outside, gathering its forces, preparing to break down her door. And the man she had once tried to push away, the man she had feared, was now the only thing standing between that darkness and her heart. He was not the storm. He was the wall that held the storm at bay. He was the warmth in the hearth, the solid roof overhead. He was the man who had brought medicine to her dying son. He was the man who had promised, with a conviction that shook her to her soul, that he would never leave. The whirlwind of her thoughts settled into a single, profound, and unshakable clarity. The war was not over. It had just begun, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, which side she was on. She rose from her chair, a new strength flowing through her limbs. She stepped toward him, and he looked up, his eyes questioning. She didn't speak. She reached out and placed her hands on either side of his rough, bearded face. She looked into his eyes, and she let him see all of it, her fear, her gratitude, her resolve, and the new, terrifying, and wonderful feeling that was blooming in the ruins of her despair. Then she leaned down and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was deep, and it was desperate, and it was decisive. It was a kiss of sealing, a pact made not with words but with the press of lips, a claiming and a surrendering all at once. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke and the faint, metallic tang of a man's resolve. It was all the words she couldn't say, all the promises she was now making in return. It was a declaration of defiance against the world outside their door. When she finally pulled back, they were both breathless. His eyes were wide, full of a stunned, dawning wonder. She rested her forehead against his, her hands still cradling his face. Her voice, when she spoke, was a low, fierce whisper, a complete and total reversal of the prayer she had uttered on that first terrible night. "Please," she breathed, "the word a vow. Stay inside this time." The kiss was a seal and a declaration. When it ended, the world rushed back in. But it was a different world. The despair that had crippled Sarah was gone, burned away by the heat of her decision and the raw, unwavering certainty in Caleb's eyes. There was no more time for talk. There was only action. The hours that followed were a blur of silent, purposeful movement. They moved around the small cabin not as a widow and a stranger, but as a single unit, a partnership forged in the crucible of a shared threat. Every action was economical, every gesture fraught with the urgency of their desperate gamble. Sarah woke Eli, her voice a low, soothing murmur that belied the frantic pounding of her own heart. She told him they were going on an adventure, a camping trip up into the hills to see the stars. His eyes, still soft with sleep, lit up with excitement, and for a painful, beautiful moment. Sarah's heart ached with a love so fierce it felt like a physical blow. She dressed him in his warmest clothes, her hands moving with a practiced efficiency while her mind raced, cataloging every essential. She packed a single, sturdy canvas sack, the last of the salted bacon, a bag of dried apples, a small tin of coffee, and a larger one of flour. She included the fever powders and the pine balsam, her hands lingering for a moment on the medicines that had started it all. She added 2 thick wool blankets and Eli's small, hand-carved wooden horse. It was a pathetic collection of belongings to represent a life, but it was all they could carry. While she worked, Caleb moved with a quiet, deadly grace. He took his gun belt from the bedding chest. He didn't strap it on, but instead methodically checked the action of the Colt, spinning the cylinder, his movements spare and precise. He loaded each chamber, the soft click of the cartridges seating into place the only sound in the room besides the crackle of the dying fire. He laid the pistol and the belt on the table, then took up Sarah's Winchester. He checked its load as well, his expression grim. He was a man preparing for war. He went outside into the frigid, moonlit night. The air was sharp and clean and carried the scent of wet earth and pine. He led his bay horse from the lean-to. The animal was still thin from its ordeal, but its head was up, its eyes alert. Caleb spoke to it in a low, rumbling murmur, stroking its neck as he saddled it with a care that was almost tender. He was not just preparing a beast of burden. He was preparing a partner in their flight. When he came back inside, his face was a hard, emotionless mask. "The moon will be down in an hour," he said. "We leave then. We'll have a few hours of darkness before the dawn." Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She looked at Eli, who had fallen asleep again in the rocking chair, his face a small, perfect picture of innocence. The sheer, terrible risk of what they were about to do washed over her. To take a child out into the wilderness, to flee from the law, to put all their faith in this one man and his desperate plan. It was in that moment of doubt that the sound came. A single sharp bark from a coyote, far off in the hills, and then an answer, the unmistakable rhythmic crunch of hooves on the muddy trail. Not one horse, many. They were coming. They had not waited the 3 days. Caleb was at the door in an instant, peering through a tiny crack. His body went rigid. "It's them," he breathed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Brody, the deputy! And Finch!" He turned, his eyes blazing in the lamplight. "They've come early. They mean to finish this tonight." All the air went out of the room. The frantic energy of their escape plan collapsed into the cold, hard reality of a siege. They were trapped. Caleb moved without a moment's hesitation. He strode to the table, strapped on his gun belt, the leather creaking in the silence. The Colt settled on his hip with a familiar, deadly weight. He picked up the Winchester. "Sarah," he said, his voice a command. "Take Eli into the corner, away from the door and the window. Stay down." He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw no fear, only a terrible, final resolve. He was the man who had promised to stay. He was keeping his word. She did as he said, her body moving on instinct. She scooped the sleeping Eli from the chair, his small body a warm, heavy weight against her chest. She carried him to the far corner, behind the heavy wooden chest, and crouched down, shielding him with her own body. The hoofbeats stopped outside. A heavy silence descended, filled only by the frantic hammering of Sarah's own heart. "Caleb Cross," a voice shouted. It was Sheriff Brody. "I know you're in there. I have a writ for the boy, and I have a warrant for you. For the shooting of 3 men down at the pass." Sarah's blood ran cold. A warrant. They weren't just here for Eli. They were here for Caleb. Caleb stood beside the door, the long barrel of the Winchester resting in the crook of his arm, his face a mask of stone. He did not answer. "Don't be a fool." "Cross," Brody shouted again. "There's no way out. Finch here is a witness to you threatening a federal officer." Alistair Finch, of course. He had twisted their brief, tense encounter into a federal crime. He had left them no room to move, no legal ground to stand on. "You have until the count of 10 to open this door and surrender," Brody yelled. "Or we're coming in." This was it, the end. Sarah closed her eyes, clutching Eli tighter, her mind filled with the terrifying sound of splintering wood and gunfire. "1," Brody's voice echoed in the night. Caleb took a deep breath. He was not going to surrender. He was going to fight. He was going to die here, in her cabin, for her son. 2, but then a new sound, more hoofbeats, a single rider, coming hard and fast from the east, from the direction of the main trail. "Hold your fire! Sheriff!" a new voice boomed, a voice filled with an authority that cut through the tension like a hot knife. Sarah risked a glance over the edge of the chest. Caleb was frozen, listening. Outside, Brody and his men had fallen silent. The new rider galloped into the small clearing and reined his horse to a dramatic, sliding halt. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a long duster and a flat-brimmed hat. Even in the dim moonlight, Sarah could see the glint of a star on his chest, but it was not the simple star of a county sheriff. It was larger, more ornate. "Who in the hell are you?" Brody demanded, his voice tight with suspicion. The man swung down from his horse. "You, Marshal John Gable," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of the federal government. "And I'm taking charge of this situation. My business is with the man inside, Caleb Cross." Alistair Finch spurred his horse forward. "Marshal, this man is a known killer. He has taken refuge with this woman and is a threat to her child. We have a court order." The marshal held up a hand, silencing Finch with a single, dismissive gesture. He ignored him, his full attention on the cabin door. "Cross," the marshal called out. "My name is John Gable. I've been tracking you for 2 weeks. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to thank you." The silence that followed was absolute. "The men you engaged at the pass," the marshal continued, his voice clear and strong. "They weren't just claim jumpers. They were part of an opium smuggling ring running supplies up from the railroad to the mining camps. We've been trying to break them for a year. The information you've been feeding us through Sister Mary Catherine, it led us right to their main depot. We took it down last night, the whole operation." Sarah's mind reeled. The medicine for the nun, it had been a cover. He had been working with the law. He wasn't running from his past. He was actively trying to destroy it, piece by painful piece. "As for the shooting at the pass," the marshal said, his voice hardening as he turned to look at Brody and Finch. "My deputy found their camp. It was an ambush, plain and simple. Cross acted in self-defense. Furthermore, in light of his cooperation, the territorial governor has issued a full and unconditional pardon for all past offenses." Alistair Finch made a choked, sputtering sound. "Pardon, this is an outrage. He's a criminal." "According to the United States government," the marshal said, his voice like chipped granite, "he's a free citizen. Now, "Sheriff, I'll be taking a look at that writ." Slowly, his face a mask of stunned disbelief, Brody handed the paper down. The marshal unfolded it, read it quickly by the moonlight, and then, with a look of utter contempt for Alistair Finch, he tore the paper in half, and then in half again, and let the pieces flutter to the muddy ground. "This is a malicious and frivolous action. Mr. Finch," the marshal said, his voice dangerously low, "and I'll be having a long talk with Judge Patterson about how he came to sign it. Now, I suggest the three of you ride out of here before I decide to start asking questions about interfering with a federal witness." Without another word, Finch and the Reverend spurred their horses and fled into the darkness. Sheriff Brody hesitated for a moment, then gave a single, curt nod to the marshal, and followed them, his authority completely undone. Inside the cabin, Caleb slowly lowered the Winchester. The tension drained out of him, leaving him looking exhausted, but whole. He opened the door. He and Marshal Gable stood there for a moment. Two large, formidable men, sizing each other up in the pale light of the coming dawn. "You took a hell of a risk, Cross," the marshal said, a grudging respect in his voice. "It seemed worth taking," Caleb replied. The wedding took place 2 weeks later. The last of the snow had melted, leaving the earth smelling rich and alive with the promise of spring. It was not held in a church, but in the clearing in front of the cabin, the place where Sarah's fear had finally been defeated. Reverend Michael was not there. Instead, Marshal Gable himself had ridden to Rock Creek and returned with the old, kind-faced circuit preacher Caleb had spoken of. The only other guests were 2 families from neighboring homesteads, quiet, hard-working people who had always shown Sarah kindness and had never listened to the town's gossip. Sarah wore her best dress, a simple blue calico, and she had woven some of the first brave spring wildflowers into her hair. Caleb stood beside her, looking strange and wonderful in a new, clean shirt, his face scrubbed, his beard neatly trimmed. He stood tall and straight, the shadows gone from his eyes, replaced by a steady, quiet light. Eli, his face shining with an irrepressible joy, served as the ring-bearer. He carried 2 simple, thin gold bands, purchased by the marshal in Cheyenne, on a small, embroidered pillow Sarah had made. He stood beside Caleb, his small hand holding tight to the man's large one, his eyes bright with a happiness that made Sarah's heart feel like it would burst. "Now I have a father," he had whispered to her that morning, his voice filled with awe, "to teach me archery and talk about the stars." The preacher's words were simple, his voice kind, but when Sarah and Caleb spoke their vows, looking only at each other, the simple words were filled with the weight of all they had endured. They were promises not just of love, but of sanctuary, promises to be the wall against the storm, promises to always stay inside. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a long, golden glow over the greening land, Sarah stood on the porch, a cup of warm tea in her hands. The guests were gone, and a comfortable, happy peace had settled over the cabin. In the field below, Caleb was laughing, his deep, rumbling laugh a sound she knew she would never grow tired of. He swung Eli up onto his broad shoulders, and the boy's delighted squeals echoed in the clear evening air. She watched them, the 2 men in her life, silhouetted against the vibrant colors of the setting sun, her husband, her son, her family. A feeling of gratitude so profound it was almost painful washed over her. She thought back to that first night, to the howling wind and the freezing cold, to the terrified, lonely woman who had stood in the darkness, clutching a rifle, whispering a desperate, fearful prayer. She had been so sure that opening the door would be the end of her world. She had been wrong. It had been the beginning. "I was right to open the door," she whispered to herself, a soft, happy smile gracing her lips. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help even more, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more listeners like you.